Welcome to the second part of our structured text and sequential function charts example for a movie ticketing system. Just a quick recap from the last video. We'd set up a SFC with a setup step followed by a waiting for input step, then select the ticket type, select the number of tickets, pay for the tickets, and then print the tickets. And once that was finished, the user has their printed tickets and it goes back to the start for waiting for input again, or waiting for someone to select on a welcome screen for the next user. We'd also set up 4 variables, one for family weekly price, single weekly price, family movie price, that's a single movie, and a single movie price. That's for a single movie, obviously, for one person. We had set up values for them, €10, etc. And that was all given in the last presentation. To save some time, I've gone ahead and I've created a few extra variables. I've created 6 variables here for the different HMI buttons. HMI remove €5 from total, total pass selected finished, remove from total pass selected, pass type selected finished, add to total pass selected, and the welcome button. I've put them all into the working memory space and it's all under byte 0 or word 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 2 extra variables here which I'll discuss when we're going through the code. This is just a way of creating a differential type function within structured text. We also created some variables used on the PLC software. Total cost for passes, this will be the total cost that the user will pay. The total passes selected, this is the number of passes selected by the user, and the pass type selected. So each pass type has been given a number between 0 and 4. We've also got a timer for simulating the printer, and we've also got a boolean here, which is another working bit for using when the printer is actually started, the timer started. There's another special one here I've set up, which is for screen select. And that's for selecting the screen we want to change from the PLC. So there's 2 ways of selecting this screen. One is from the PLC and one is from within the HMI. What we're going to do now is look at the CX Designer and set up those particular types of screens. I'm back in CX Designer and I opened up the same project that we created in the previous video, and I'm going to go into System Settings. So from System Settings here, I can create, or I can select different variables and types for this particular system. So within the initialization section up here, I have 2 system memory addresses, the B and the W. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set each of those to PLC DM00100, PLC DM00100. This will allow me to use the data memory address 100 in order to change the screen from within the PLC. Okay, so let's look through how our HMI is set up. We have a single button here which simply goes to the next screen, which is select the type of pass. We have 4 buttons here, 1, 2, 3, 4, which are going to use to select the pass type. So this will be pass type 0, this will be pass type 1, 2 and 3. 0, 1, 2, 3. This next button will simply go to the next screen. Once this screen loads, I have 2 buttons here, 1, 2, to add more or remove more tickets from the number I've selected, and again another next button. And finally, we've got one other button here, which is the €5 to remove €5 from the total owed. So let's count how many buttons I need to actually configure. From the start, 1 button, 2 buttons, because remember these are all 4 buttons that are just selecting the pass type, 3, 4 buttons, 5 buttons, and finally 6 buttons. So let's look at the variables I created earlier in the presentation. From the start here I have the welcome button, then I have a button to transfer to the next screen, pass type selection finished. That's where we have the 4 buttons. The next button is to add to total passes, and then remove from total passes, and then total pass selection finished. That's just the next button. So 1 next button and 2 next buttons. And the final button we have is to just remove €5 from the total. So these are all the buttons I've set up. Let's look at the pass selection. So the pass type selection is being stored in D10. The total number of passes selected is being stored in D12. And the total cost of the passes is being stored in D14. The total number of passes can be calculated by multiplying the cost of a single pass by the total number of passes selected. We'll see how we do that later in the code. Finally, I've added a timer here, which is for printing. And this is the screen select variable that allows me to change the screen from the HMI, and that is D100. Back in the HMI, you can see that there, DM or data memory 100. So what do those variables look like within CX Programmer? These are my HMIs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is my diffs, which we'll talk about when we're looking at the code. There's my timer start. If I move down a little, you can see the screen select variable, the total costs of the passes, total passes selected, and the pass type selected. And these are the 4 variables that we created in the previous video to store the price. Back in CX Designer, let's have a look at setting up the first button. So I'm going to double click, and you can see that this is a simple on-off push button. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change this now to a multifunction button. I could have selected multifunction button from the beginning here, see the MF, but I selected on-off button when I set up this particular HMI. So to convert this to a multifunction button, I simply press convert. This gives me a new screen, and I can select many different options here, but we're just going to concentrate on 2 options in particular. All we want this to do is to swap the screen. So at the moment we have when pressed, this button will write a bit. Instead, we want it to swap screen. Selecting swap screen, I'm going to select swap screen. I'm going to select the screen I want to swap to, and it's going to be pass type. So now this button will swap to the next screen. When in the pass type screen, I'm going to select the first button of the 4, and I'm going to convert this to a multifunction button. With that done, rather than writing a bit, I'm going to go to write, and I'm going to write a word. So it's an integer I want to write, and I'm going to set the value, and I'm going to set the value to 0. The word I'm going to select from the list is going to be pass type selected. And click OK, and go OK. The next one, convert this button. And again, I'm going to write a word, and in this case, select from the list, it's going to be pass type again. And it's going to be 1. And repeat, convert. It's going to be 2. This one's going to be 3. It's pass type again. So that's my 4 buttons. So what will happen is when I select this button, the value for pass type will be updated to a 0. This will be 1, this will be 2, and this will be 3. And this will allow me to determine which pass type has been selected by the user. I can also select along here the different price for each pass. We'll just leave them blank for a minute. Let's just deal with the buttons for now. So my next button, select that. I'm going to convert it to a multifunction button. Again, all I want to do here is swap the screen. So I'm going to go swap screen, and the screen I'm going to select is the number of tickets. So now I'm going to go to the number of tickets screen. I've got 3 buttons on this screen, so let's start with the more. And I'm going to convert this to a multifunction button as well. In this case, we only want to update a single bit, so we could use the standard button, but let's keep them all as multifunction for now. And it's going to be add to total. And this again, let's just leave this one as a multifunction as well. And this one's going to be remove. Remove from total passes selected. Let's actually add the total number of passes we want, which is total passes selected. And the next button again, which needs to be a multifunction button. Let's change that to a swap screen. And this time we're going to want to pay. In the pay screen, we've only got 1 button, so let's select that. Let's convert it as well. And this is just going to be the remove €5 from the total. And this is going to be the total owed, total cost of passes. And finally, the print ticket, we'll worry about that when we're doing the code. So that's our HMI setup. So let's get back to look at CX Programmer and add in some of the structured text. I've gone ahead and I've cleaned up the SFC in order to suit the HMI that we developed. I've removed the action here from select a number of tickets because we're now using the HMI to do that by changing the value of the type of pass. We could have done this using an action as well. That's just the way I decided to do it for this particular example, to demonstrate just a way of doing it. I've also renamed the action update total passes. I've renamed the action pay bill, and I've renamed the action print tickets. From my actions menu over here, you will need to remove unused actions and unmoved transactions from your system because it can cause errors. So let's go ahead now and look at the code that belongs to my first action, which is going to be updating total passes. This makes up the code that we have within the update total passes structured text. It's made up of two if statements and a case statement. The first if statement checks if I need to add, or if the user is selected, add to the total number of passes. The second if removes from the number of passes. And the case statement checks if it was 0, 1, 2 or 3 that was selected as the pass type. Let's look at each section in a bit more detail. First of all, the first if statement. So I've highlighted the if, the then and the end if. Each statement within function text for an if has to have an if, a then and an end if. And remember, you need the semicolon here at the end if. What I'm asking here is if the user has selected to add to the total number of passes and the total number of passes has not already been pressed, that's where the not comes from, so it's not pressed, then add 1 to the total number of passes. The total number of passes selected equals the total number of passes selected plus 1. And remember, the colon you need to put in front of the equals. The next if statement is the same as the first, except this time I'm removing from the total number of passes selected. Again, I have a not here, and I'm saying if the button isn't already pressed, then remove 1. Let's look at an example. The user is about to select to add 1 to the total number of passes. At this stage, the diff here, this variable here, is equal to 0, and the HMI is equal to 0 because it hasn't been pressed. When this code runs through, this will still be equal to 1, but this will be equal to 0 because it hasn't gone through the code yet. The next time the code runs, this will be equal to 1, but because this is already equal to 1, because that's what it's set here, this is equal to 1, so it will not update. It will keep running through this and it won't update the total number of passes. When the user releases the button, the total number of passes is equal to 0, so the differential will go to 0, and the next time it comes around, i.e. the next time the user presses the button, this will now be equal to 0, so it will count another. This is not a perfect solution, but it does work for slow moving systems like push buttons. The case statement evaluates the variable pass type selected and checks it against this particular list. 0, 1, 2 or 3. So these are the variables, or these are the values I should say, that this particular variable can be equal to. Depending on which value it is, it will run the associated line beside it. You can use an if statement instead of a case statement. They will do exactly the same thing, an if else if. It's just a case statement is a little bit neater, and there's also savings in the amount of iterations required or the amount of ticks required to run this statement. But let's just look at this first one. If it's a 0, the total cost of the passes is equal to the single movie pass multiplied by the total passes selected. If it's a 1, we're looking at a single weekly pass, and that's multiplied by the total. If it's a 2, it's a family movie pass, and that's also multiplied by the total. And if it's a 3, it's a weekly total pass. You can also have a default in here if it's not the 1, 2, or the 3, or the 0. We shouldn't have that problem in our code because we only have 4 buttons. but you really should put that in as a default for security reasons and for other reasons of debugging, etc. So let's go back to CX Programmer and see where we actually put this code. And there is the code. There's my first if statement, my second if statement, my two differential checks, and my case statement. So let's look at my next action, which is for the bill. And this is a very straightforward action. When someone presses the HMI remove €5, it simply removes or minuses €5 from the total cost of the passes. Remember, when you're doing this, you need to put the and sign in front to tell it that you're looking at this as a number and not a binary value. Within the action print ticket, we're waiting for the transaction to complete, tickets paid for, and we're setting this variable start timer. This set command will leave the start timer on until we set it off again. When the start timer is running, I'm running this timer, and the timer will run for a total of 5 seconds to simulate the printer running. And that's all my transactions, including the last one, which we set up in the previous video, where we set the values. I've also added in here screen select to 0, so that the system will always start on screen 0. Let's look at the transitions and how we actually set them up. The first transition we'll look at is system selection started. So in this transition, we're going to add a contact, and the contact is going to be HMI _ welcome, because that was the welcome button. Now we've added a contact, we need to add a coil. When I add a coil, it will automatically fill in the name of the transition, so I'll just go OK. What happens when somebody presses the HMI welcome is it sets this transition equal to true. If we go back to look at our actual SFC, with the SFC you can see when the button is pressed, it will move me on to the next selection or select ticket type. We have no action here, so we need to work out what happens to make this transition go true. Remember, transitions can only be true or false, a 1 or a 0. So for this transition, the next button needs to be pressed. So within ticket type selection, I'm going to select a contact. I'm going to select pass type selection finished. I'm going to add a new coil, and that autofills for me, and I go OK. Let's look at the next transition. The next transition will be true when the user has selected the right number of tickets. To do that, they're going to select next, like we did for the previous transition. So let's update that transition. I've added a contactor, total passes selection finished, and the transition is the coil. So we're now within the pay for tickets, and the action here, pay for tickets, takes €5 off the total. So we need to check when this gets to 0 or below, and only at that point do we move on to the printing tickets. So how do we do that? Well, let's look at the transition. So in this transition, we're going to add a new function, and we're going to say less than and s to say that it's a number, space total cost of passes, space 0. What we're saying here is if the total number of passes is less than 0, do something. So what do we want it to do? Well, the first thing we want it to do is finish that transition and move on to the next. The next thing we want it to do is also change screen. To change the screen, this time I'm going to use a new instruction. I'm going to use the move command. Move space screen selected. Screen selected. Let's just check what screen I want to use. And it's screen 4, print ticket. Don't forget the and sign and 4. So now that transition's gone to true, that is the total number owed has gone to 0, we can now move to the next action. In the transition, we're going to use this print timer to move the transition into true. So we're going to add a contact, print timer. We're going to add a coil, which will autofill, and then we want to change the screen. And let's change the screen back to screen 0, because we're going back to the start. So move space at 0, screen select. And that's my final transition completed. Back in the SFC, we've now completed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 transitions, and we've completed all the actions. Now we've got our code configured, let's set up our transitions. So we have our switch screen, but we need to add the transition. So let's go to when pressed, add, and I'm going to add the transition, or the button press, which is welcome. My next one, I have to add, and it's going to be a button press, and in this case it's going to be pass type selection finished. The next again, I'm going to add a button type, and this time it's going to be add to total passes selection finished. So that's my transitions now configured within the HMI, so we can go ahead and test. Tools and test, and let's see what happens. So the simulation started. So the first thing we're going to do is press the button to start, and we're given an option to select from 1, 2, 3, 4, single ticket, weekly ticket, family movie, or family weekly. I can select one of these. Unfortunately, my UI at the moment doesn't actually indicate which one I've pressed, and I still don't have a total cost for each of the pass. We'll look at this in the next video. So let me just select single movie pass, and next. I can select my number. I have 2 selected at the moment, 1, 0, but I can also go to -1, which I shouldn't be able to do, or else the user is going to get a credit. So let's just leave it at 1. I probably shouldn't be able to select 0 either. So let's leave it at 1 and click next. So I owe the grand total of €10. So let me just simulate taking 5 off it. There you go. It's now printing for 5 seconds. And it's completed, and it's gone back to the start. So let's look at that again, but this time let's put up the SFC beside it. So here's the same sequence with the SFC beside it. It's waiting for input, and you can see there it's been waiting for 32, 33, 34 seconds. So I'm going to press the button. It's now moved on, and it's highlighting the second step because it's passed through this transition. I pressed the button. So now you can see here, I can select one of these, and it's still within that transition. So let's press next. It moves on to the next step. It's running for 8 seconds. Let's look at the action that's assigned to it. So add and take away 1. And let's look at the code. So this is the code that's running, and these are the values at the moment. So at the moment, the total pass selected was 1, and you can see here that the pass type was 3, and it's 10 by 100 by 1. So let's put that up. And now it's equal to 200, 300. So let's just leave it at 1. And let's select next. Now we're in the pay window. Back in our SFC, you can see we're on the pay step, and let's look at the next action. Within this action, it's a ladder. I press the button and you should see 5 going off my total. So there we go, 95, 90, 85, 80, 75, 70, and so on, right the way down until I get to 0. Now remember, I could actually put in a €20, so there could be a minus figure here, which means I'd need to give change. At the moment, the UI doesn't cater for that. Back to 0. Now we're here at printing. You can see here, we're waiting for the timer to finish, and the timer's finished, and we're back at waiting. And let's look at our UI to confirm that, and there's my UI back at 0. So that's the end of this video. I hope it's been of some help. I know it's been a little bit long and probably a bit hard to follow. We covered this in a lot more detail in class. At the end of this video, I'll add a series of screenshots for the most important things you need to know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video when we look at updating the HMI interface to make it a bit more usable and user friendly.